The city that Ibn Battuta entered in the year 1326 had already forgotten most of what had made it famous. He was a young scholar from Tangier, not yet 30, at the start of a journey that would eventually carry him across nearly the entire known world of Islam, from the Atlantic coast of Morocco to the court of the Yuan Emperor in China. Alexandria was one of his first stops, and by his own account, he approached it the way a pilgrim approaches a shrine, expecting a marvel and finding, mostly, a marvel already in decline. He climbed the long vaulted ramp that spiraled up into the base of the Pharos, the great lighthouse that had stood on its harbor island for over 1,500 years, guiding ships past the shoals that made this stretch of the Egyptian coast so treacherous. He measured what he saw. He recorded the tower's base as roughly 140 spans on each side, still square, still recognizably the structure that classical writers had once ranked among the 7 wonders of the world. It was damaged, sections had fallen, but it stood, and a man could climb it and stand at its entrance and look out over the harbor the way sailors and geographers and curious travelers had done for centuries before him. He came back 23 years later, in 1349, an older and much more traveled man by then, and the lighthouse he had climbed as a young scholar was gone in every way that mattered. Not gone from the earth, the base was still there, a wreck of stone on the harbor's edge, but gone as a structure a person could enter. Ibn Battuta wrote that he found it in so ruinous a condition that it was not even possible to go inside it, or to climb up to what remained of its doorway. An earthquake, one of a long series that had been shaking loose the upper stories of the tower for 4 centuries, had finally taken the parts of it that had still been standing on his first visit. He did not linger long on the loss. He noted it the way a careful traveler notes a change in a landscape, and moved on to describe the rest of the city, its markets, its mosques, the state of its walls, before continuing east. What is striking, reading his account today, is not the lighthouse's ruin. Buildings fall. Earthquakes are not villains. They do not require explanation, only description, and Ibn Battuta gave one, plainly, in the manner of a man recording a fact rather than mourning a tragedy. What is striking is everything Ibn Battuta did not see and did not think to mention, because by 1349 there was nothing left in Alexandria to see. Somewhere in this same city, roughly 1,600 years before his first visit, there had stood an institution that assembled, by some ancient estimates, hundreds of thousands of written works. The accumulated mathematics, medicine, astronomy, geography, and literature of the entire Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, gathered under royal patronage and maintained, for a time, as the most ambitious concentration of recorded knowledge the world had yet produced. A Moroccan scholar making a careful survey of Alexandria's monuments in the 14th century, a man who measured a broken lighthouse in spans and wrote down what he found, does not mention the library at all. He does not mention its site. He does not mention a ruin, a foundation, a local memory of where it once stood, a rumor passed down about how it ended. There is nothing there for a careful traveler to record, because there is nothing there. This is the detail worth sitting with before going any further. The lighthouse gave Ibn Battuta a ruin. It gave him stones to measure, a doorway to describe as impassable, a specific and datable moment of loss he could set against his own memory of climbing it as a younger man. The library gave later visitors nothing of the kind. Not because its loss was less total, but because its loss had no single moment attached to it. No earthquake, no fire, no army with torches that a chronicler could name and blame and describe. It did not collapse. It faded over centuries, so gradually and so administratively that by the time anyone thought to ask where it had gone, there was no one left who could say, and no ruin left to visit in search of an answer. Alexander arrived on the Egyptian coast in the winter of 332 BC, fresh from the conquest of Tyre and Gaza, and found a stretch of shoreline that most people would have overlooked, a narrow strip of land between the Mediterranean and a shallow lake, fronted by a small island the locals called Pharos, with a modest fishing village named Rakotis nearby. He was not looking for a fishing village. According to the tradition later reported by his historians, he walked the ground himself, sketched the outline of a city with his own hands. Some accounts say he used grain, scattered across the site to mark out streets and walls, because there was no chalk to hand, and set architects to work on a grid of broad avenues and a harbor system that would take advantage of the island offshore to create 2 protected anchorages instead of 1. He gave the city his own name, as he had already done and would do again elsewhere across his empire, and then he left. Alexander never saw Alexandria built. He marched on into Egypt's interior, then into Persia and beyond, and would be dead within 9 years, in Babylon, without ever returning to the city on the coast that would eventually outlast every other place he named after himself. His death in 323 BC left no clear heir capable of holding his empire together, and what followed was 4 decades of warfare among his former generals, each carving out a portion of the conquered world for himself. Among them was Ptolemy, son of Lagus, a Macedonian officer who had served with Alexander since childhood and who moved quickly, in the chaos after the king's death, to secure Egypt as his own province. Ptolemy's most consequential act in those early years was not a battle, it was a theft. When Alexander's funeral procession set out from Babylon toward Macedon, intending to bury the conqueror in the traditional royal grounds of his homeland, Ptolemy intercepted the cortege in Syria and diverted the body to Egypt instead, eventually installing it in Alexandria itself. It was, on one level, an act of naked political theater. Possession of the conqueror's body carried enormous symbolic weight, and Ptolemy understood exactly what he was claiming by taking it. But it also announced something about the kind of rule he intended to build. Alexandria was not going to be a provincial capital administered at arm's length. It was going to be the center of something, a seat of legitimacy deliberately built to rival the old centers of Greek civilization, and Ptolemy spent the following decades making that ambition concrete. He took the title of king for himself in 305 BC, becoming Ptolemy the First, founder of a dynasty that would rule Egypt for nearly 3 centuries afterward, and he set about surrounding himself with exactly the kind of people who could turn a young Macedonian garrison town into a genuine capital of learning. Among the men he drew to his court was Demetrius of Phalerum, an Athenian statesman and philosopher who had once governed Athens itself and who had studied, in his youth, under Aristotle at the Lyceum. Demetrius arrived in Alexandria as an exile, his political career in Athens having ended in defeat and flight, but he brought with him something Ptolemy wanted badly: direct, personal knowledge of how Aristotle had organized his own school, its library, its research program, its community of scholars living and working under one roof, pursuing knowledge as a shared and funded enterprise rather than a private hobby for the wealthy. It was Demetrius, ancient tradition holds, who advised Ptolemy on how to build something similar in Alexandria, but grander, backed by the resources of an actual kingdom rather than the private means of a philosopher. What resulted, founded in the years around 295 BC, was called the Mouseion, literally, a shrine to the Muses, the patron goddesses of the arts and sciences, and the choice of name mattered. This was not conceived, at its founding, as a library in the way a modern person might picture one, a public building where citizens come to borrow books. It was conceived as a temple, with a resident priest appointed by the king himself, and the scholars who lived and worked within it were understood, in a formal sense, to be in service to the Muses' cult. That religious framing gave the institution a kind of permanence that a purely secular academy might not have had. It placed the museum inside the category of things a Hellenistic king was expected, as a matter of piety and prestige, to endow and protect. But the framing also meant something more practical and more consequential for everything that would happen to the institution over the following centuries. The museum existed, from its very first day, as an arm of royal patronage. It had no independent endowment, no guild of citizens funding it collectively, no source of continuity that did not run directly back to whoever currently held the Egyptian throne. It was built to order, by a king, for a king's purposes, and it would only ever be as secure as the next king's willingness to keep paying for it. This mattered immediately in the choices Ptolemy and his successors made about what the institution was for. Aristotle himself, according to the geographer Strabo, writing centuries later, had been the first person known to have assembled a substantial personal library and to have taught the kings of Egypt how such a collection ought to be arranged. A claim that, whether or not it is taken literally, reflects how directly the Ptolemies understood their project as a continuation and expansion of the Lyceum's model. Demetrius is said to have urged Ptolemy toward an almost limitless ambition, not merely a respectable collection of Greek philosophy and poetry, but an attempt to gather copies of every significant text that existed anywhere, in any language, an accumulation without precedent in the ancient world. Whether that ambition was Demetrius's own phrasing or a later embellishment of it, the Ptolemies acted as though they had accepted the challenge literally, and the methods they would use to pursue it, methods that ranged from diplomatic requests to what amounted to organized confiscation at the city's own harbor, would become one of the more notorious features of the institution's early history. Alexandria itself was built to support this ambition in ways that went beyond the museum's walls. Ptolemy and his successors laid out a royal quarter that, according to later visitors, occupied as much as a third of the entire city, an enormous complex of palaces, gardens, and monuments connected to one another and to the twin harbors by colonnaded walkways. The museum was situated inside this royal quarter, not in some separate scholarly district removed from the machinery of the state, but literally attached to the palace, a detail that later geographers would specifically note, and one that made unmistakably clear where the institution's authority and its funding both originated. A scholar admitted to the museum was not joining an independent academy in the way a modern person might imagine. He was entering the orbit of the crown itself, housed within sight of the throne that paid his way. No description of the museum survives from the lifetime of the men who built it. The fullest surviving account comes from Strabo, a Greek geographer who visited Alexandria around 25 BC, more than 2.5 centuries after Demetrius first advised Ptolemy on its design, by which point Egypt had already passed from the Ptolemies into Roman hands. Strabo's account is brief, a handful of sentences in a much larger geographical survey, but it is nearly the only eyewitness description that has come down intact, and it is worth taking seriously precisely because of how little it dwells on books. Strabo does not describe shelves, or scrolls, or a reading room. He describes a place to live and work. The museum, he writes, is part of the royal quarter itself, possessed of a covered walkway for exercise and conversation, a seating hall for lectures and debate, and a large communal building containing the dining hall where the resident scholars took their meals together. He notes, almost in passing, that this community of learned men held property in common, and that a priest presided over the institution, a post that had originally been filled by royal appointment under the Ptolemies and was, by Strabo's own time, filled instead by the authority of the Roman emperor. That last detail deserves attention because it marks the first visible sign of a transition that would matter enormously later on. The office of the museum's priest had passed, without apparent disruption, from Ptolemaic to Roman appointment, which meant the institution's formal head of state patronage was no longer a Macedonian dynasty raised in the city and personally invested in its prestige, but a distant imperial administration governing Egypt as one province among many. Strabo records this transfer of authority as a simple fact, not as an alarm. In his own day, it plainly was not one, but it established, quietly and early, exactly the mechanism by which the institution's fortunes would eventually be decided a century and more later, not by the scholars inside it, and not by the people of Alexandria, but by whoever happened to be sitting in Rome. Other ancient writers filled in details that Strabo left out, and their tone toward the museum's residents was frequently less reverent than modern imagination tends to be. Athenaeus, a Greek writer working roughly 2 centuries after Strabo, described the scholars who lived and dined inside the institution in a phrase that has survived precisely because of its needling wit. He wrote that these men, supported entirely at royal expense, were fed like the choicest birds kept in a coop, well-fattened, well-housed, and entirely dependent on their keeper. It is a courtier's joke rather than a historian's judgment, and it should be read as one, but it captures something true about the structure Strabo had described more soberly. Membership in the museum was not an academic appointment in any sense a later age would recognize. It was closer to a royal pension attached to a shared table granted to men whose only obligation, in return, was to produce work that reflected well on the ruler footing the bill. A later writer, Philostratus, recorded that the Emperor Hadrian had once arranged for a favored scholar to be enrolled among those who received free meals at the museum, and felt it necessary to explain to his own readers, writing in the early 3rd century, exactly what the museum was. By this he meant, Philostratus wrote, a dining table in Egypt to which the most distinguished men of every country were invited. That an educated Roman audience needed the institution explained to them at all suggests how much its original character, so tied to a specific Ptolemaic Alexandria, had already begun to recede from common knowledge even while the museum itself still stood and functioned. The men who held this privileged and precarious position were not, strictly speaking, librarians in the modern sense, though the position of chief librarian did exist and carried enormous prestige. The office was typically filled by whichever resident scholar the king judged most distinguished, and it came with responsibilities that extended well beyond simple custodianship. The librarian was expected to organize the collection, direct its expansion, and often to tutor the royal children directly, a detail that reveals, again, how tightly the institution was bound into the personal household of the ruling dynasty rather than existing as a separate public trust. Eratosthenes, who would later become one of the most celebrated scholars ever associated with the museum, held this post for decades and was entrusted, alongside his research, with the education of the crown prince himself. The arrangement gave the librarian direct access to the throne and, through it, direct influence over the resources allocated to the collection's growth. But it also meant that the position's authority rose and fell with the librarian's personal standing at court, rather than resting on any independent institutional footing. Recruitment into this world followed patterns that later academic institutions would recognize, even if the underlying logic was different. The Ptolemies actively sought out the most accomplished mathematicians, physicians, poets, and astronomers from across the Greek-speaking world and offered them what amounted to an irresistible proposition: a guaranteed income, comfortable housing, freedom from the ordinary burdens of teaching large numbers of students or earning a living through private practice, and access to the largest concentration of written material anywhere in the Mediterranean, all in exchange for residence in Alexandria and, implicitly, for the prestige their presence would lend the dynasty that hosted them. Scholars came from Athens, from Cyrene, from the Greek cities of Asia Minor and Sicily, drawn by an offer that had no real precedent. Nowhere else could a mathematician or a poet expect to be paid indefinitely by a king simply to think and to write, surrounded by colleagues doing the same. It was, in effect, a form of patronage more total than anything the old Greek city-states had ever extended to their own philosophers, who had generally supported themselves through fees, private wealth, or the goodwill of individual benefactors rather than a standing royal stipend. Feeding an institution built on this scale required more than royal enthusiasm. It required a supply of actual texts In a world where every copy of every work had to be produced by hand, one scribe at a time, and where no single city, however wealthy, could simply commission the sum total of Greek literature into existence from nothing. The Ptolemies solved this problem the way ambitious rulers have generally solved problems of scarcity throughout history, through a combination of diplomacy, expense, and, when those failed to move quickly enough, outright compulsion. The diplomatic route produced one of the best-known anecdotes associated with the library's early growth, involving Athens and the official texts of its three great tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. According to the tradition preserved by later writers, Ptolemy the Third petitioned the city of Athens for permission to borrow its official state copies of the tragedians' complete works, offering a substantial deposit of silver as security for their return. Athens agreed, reluctantly, and Ptolemy is said to have kept the deposit, sent Athens high-quality copies instead, and retained the originals in Alexandria permanently, a story that, whether embellished in its details or not, reflects accurately enough the lengths the dynasty was willing to go to secure texts of unquestioned authority rather than settling for whatever imperfect copies happened to circulate. More systematic and considerably less genteel was the policy applied at Alexandria's own harbor. Every ship that docked in the city, according to the account preserved by Galen centuries later, was subject to search for books. Any scrolls found aboard were confiscated, brought to the library, and copied by the institution's scribes. The copies, not the originals, were then returned to the ship's owner, while the genuine texts stayed in Alexandria's collection. These confiscated volumes were reportedly cataloged under the label "From the Ships," a designation that survived in library records specifically to distinguish material acquired this way from texts obtained through purchase or diplomatic exchange. It was, in effect, a form of intellectual customs duty, levied not in coin but in books, and it turned Alexandria's position as the busiest port in the Eastern Mediterranean into a direct engine of the library's growth. Every merchant vessel, every diplomatic mission, every traveling scholar passing through the harbor became, whether willingly or not, a potential source of new material. The dynasty's appetite extended beyond the Greek-speaking world entirely, and it is in this wider ambition that the true scale of Ptolemaic thinking becomes clear. The Ptolemies did not conceive of their project as a library of Greek literature alone. However, dominant Greek texts were in the actual collection. They pursued translations and originals from Egyptian, Babylonian, and Jewish traditions as well, treating the accumulation of written knowledge as a project without linguistic or cultural boundary. The most celebrated product of this ambition was the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, which later Jewish and Christian tradition credited to a team of 72 scholars brought to Alexandria under Ptolemy II, specifically to render the sacred texts into Greek for the library's shelves. The story, as later embellished in the account known as the Letter of Aristarchus, involves elaborate diplomatic exchanges with the high priest in Jerusalem and a miraculous unanimity among the translators, details modern scholars generally treat as legendary rather than historical. But the underlying fact the legend was built around, that a Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures was indeed produced in Alexandria under early Ptolemaic patronage, and that it became one of the most consequential texts in the entire history of religious literature, is not in serious dispute, and it illustrates precisely the reach the dynasty imagined for its project. Organizing a collection acquired through such varied and often chaotic means posed its own considerable challenge, and it was here that the poet and scholar Callimachus made his most lasting contribution to the institution, sometime in the middle of the 3rd century BC. Callimachus was not, so far as the evidence indicates, ever formally the library's chief librarian, but he undertook a task that librarianship in the modern sense would recognize immediately. He compiled a comprehensive catalog of the collection's contents, a work known by its Greek title as the Pinakes, or tables, organized by genre, and within each genre, alphabetically by author, with biographical notes attached and, crucially, some indication of a text's authenticity. The scale attributed to this catalog in later tradition ran to well over 100 scrolls, simply to list the collection's contents, which gives some sense of how large the holdings had already become within roughly 2 generations of the museum's founding. The Pinakes mattered for reasons beyond simple convenience. In a collection built partly through confiscation, partly through commission, and partly through purchase from dealers of uneven reliability, the question of which text represented an author's genuine work, as opposed to a later forgery or a garbled transcription, was not trivial, and Callimachus's attempt to impose order and authentication on the sprawl represents one of the first systematic acts of textual scholarship in Western history, a discipline that the library's later fame would rest on almost as much as its raw size. That raw size is, unfortunately, one of the least reliable things the ancient sources report, and it is worth being honest about the uncertainty here, rather than repeating inherited numbers as settled fact. Later writers offered figures for the collection that range enormously and were, in several documented cases, transmitted through corrupted or garbled manuscript traditions, even in antiquity. The Byzantine scholar Tsetsis, writing well over a millennium after the library's founding, cited figures suggesting the main collection held several 100,000 scrolls, with tens of thousands more housed in a secondary collection established later at the Temple of Serapis. Modern historians examining these claims closely, Roger Bagnall prominent among them, have concluded that such figures deserve essentially no credence as precise counts. The ancient world had no reliable statistical apparatus for tracking a collection of that scale, no census of scrolls comparable to a modern library's catalog system, and the specific numbers that survive appear to owe more to a general ancient fondness for impressively large round figures filtered through centuries of copying and recopying than to any actual count taken by anyone with access to the shelves. What can be said with more confidence is simpler and, in its way, more impressive. Contemporaries and near contemporaries across the Mediterranean world regarded the Alexandrian collection as unmatched, a byword for comprehensiveness that other cities' libraries were explicitly measured against and found wanting, whatever its precise scale actually was. All of this recruitment and acquisition would mean little if it had produced nothing beyond an impressively organized warehouse. It did not. Across roughly 2.5 centuries, from the institution's founding through the height of Ptolemaic rule, the scholars gathered in Alexandria produced a body of work that reshaped mathematics, astronomy, geography, and medicine so thoroughly that later centuries would, in several cases, simply inherit their conclusions without fully grasping how radical they had originally been. The clearest example, and in some ways the least celebrated relative to its actual influence, is Euclid. Almost nothing certain survives about his life. No reliable dates of birth or death, no detailed biography from a contemporary hand, only the tradition, reported by later writers including Proclus, that he taught in Alexandria in the early years of the museum's existence, likely under Ptolemy the First himself. What Euclid left behind was the Elements, a systematic compilation and logical construction of geometry built from a small set of definitions, postulates, and axioms, from which he derived an enormous body of provable results through rigorous deduction. The Elements was not, for the most part, a record of Euclid's own original discoveries. Much of the underlying mathematics had been developed by earlier Greek geometers working before him. His achievement was architectural rather than exploratory. He took scattered and unevenly rigorous mathematical knowledge and organized it into a single deductive structure so sound that it would serve as the standard introduction to geometry for something like 2,000 years afterward, studied essentially unchanged in form from ancient Alexandria through 19th century schoolrooms. Few works produced anywhere, in any field, have enjoyed a comparably long working life. where Euclid organized existing knowledge into permanent form, Eratosthenes, who served as the library's chief librarian during the reign of Ptolemy the Third in the latter part of the 3rd century BC, produced something closer to genuine discovery through ingenious method. Eratosthenes is remembered above all for calculating the circumference of the earth, a feat he accomplished without leaving Egypt, using nothing more than the length of shadows and a piece of geographical knowledge about a well in the city of Syene, far to the south. He had learned that at the summer solstice, the sun at Syene shone directly down a deep well at noon, casting no shadow at all, meaning the sun stood directly overhead at that specific location on that specific day. In Alexandria, on the same day at the same hour, a vertical marker did cast a shadow, and by measuring the angle of that shadow, Eratosthenes could calculate the difference in the sun's apparent position between the two cities. Combined with an estimate of the distance between Alexandria and Syene, obtained from the reports of professional pacers employed to measure royal roads, this angular difference allowed him to calculate the Earth's total circumference. The figure he arrived at, expressed in the ancient unit of stadia, translates to a result strikingly close to the planet's actual circumference. A calculation performed with instruments no more sophisticated than a stick, a well, and careful trigonometric reasoning, at a time when the scientific consensus already accepted, correctly, that the Earth was a sphere rather than a flat expanse. Eratosthenes also produced an influential treatise on geography, coining the very term geography for the discipline, and attempted, with far less precision but with genuine seriousness, to construct a map of the known world and a chronology of major historical events reaching back to the fall of Troy. More radical still, though far less immediately influential in his own time, was Aristarchus of Samos, an astronomer associated with Alexandria in the first half of the 3rd century BC. Aristarchus proposed, in a work that survives now only through the reports of later writers rather than in its own original form, that the sun, not the earth, stood at the center of the known cosmos, and that the Earth itself moved, rotating on its own axis daily and orbiting the sun annually along with the other planets. This is, in essence, the heliocentric model that Copernicus would present to Europe as revolutionary nearly 18 centuries later, and Aristarchus arrived at it through geometric reasoning about the relative sizes and distances of the sun and moon, based on careful, if imperfect, observation of lunar eclipses and the angles between the sun, moon, and earth. The idea did not prevail in antiquity. It was rejected by most later astronomers, Ptolemy of Alexandria prominent among them centuries afterward, in favor of an Earth-centered model that better accounted for certain observed irregularities in planetary motion, given the mathematical tools available at the time. But the fact that a fully articulated heliocentric hypothesis existed and was seriously argued for in the 3rd century BC, within the same intellectual environment the museum had assembled, stands as one of the clearest demonstrations of how far Alexandrian scholarship was willing to push against inherited assumption, even when the culture around it was not yet ready to follow. Medicine at the museum took a direction that later centuries, with their own ethical frameworks, would view with considerable unease, but that produced anatomical knowledge unmatched anywhere else in the ancient world. Herophilus, working in Alexandria in the early 3rd century BC, and his younger contemporary Aristarchus are both credited by later medical writers, Galen chief among them, with performing systematic dissections of the human body, and, according to more troubling accounts preserved by writers including Celsus, with performing vivisections on condemned criminals supplied to them by the Ptolemaic state for exactly this purpose. Whatever judgment is due on the methods involved, the resulting anatomical knowledge was extensive and precise for its time. Herophilus is credited with detailed and accurate descriptions of the nervous system, correctly distinguishing sensory from motor nerves and tracing their origin to the brain rather than the heart, a conclusion that contradicted the prevailing Aristotelian view and that later anatomy would confirm as correct. He described the structure of the eye, the liver, and the reproductive organs in detail that would not be substantially improved upon for many centuries, and he is credited with measuring the pulse using a portable water clock, an early attempt to quantify a physiological process that had previously been assessed only by touch and impression. Aristarchus, for his part, made close observations of the heart's valves and argued, correctly, against the older theory that the arteries carried air rather than blood, though his own explanation of circulation would later prove incomplete. This willingness to open the human body and observe it directly, rather than relying solely on inherited theory, marks Alexandrian medicine as a genuinely distinct and unusually empirical episode within ancient science, one that later Roman and medieval medicine, more constrained by religious and social prohibitions on dissection, would not fully recover for well over 1,000 years. Alongside this scientific work, the museum's scholars pursued a quieter but no less consequential project: the systematic editing of Greek literature, above all, the text of Homer. The Iliad and the Odyssey had circulated for centuries by the time the library began its work, copied and recopied by scribes across the Greek world with no central authority governing consistency, so that by the Hellenistic period, multiple divergent versions of both epics existed, differing in wording, in the presence or absence of individual lines, and occasionally in the ordering of entire passages. A succession of Alexandrian scholars, including Zenodotus, the library's first chief librarian, and later Aristarchus of Samothrace, a different figure from the astronomer of the same name, and the most influential Homeric editor to work at the institution, undertook the painstaking task of comparing manuscripts against one another, marking passages they judged to be later interpolations, and producing what amounted to a critical edition of both epics, complete with symbols in the margins indicating textual doubt or editorial judgment. The version of Homer that has come down to the modern world, studied in classrooms and translated into every major language, descends substantially from this Alexandrian editorial work, meaning that the two foundational poems of the entire Western literary tradition survive today largely in the specific form that scholars funded by Ptolemaic Egypt chose to preserve, out of the many variant versions that had once existed and that this same editorial process quietly allowed to fall away. Ptolemaic Egypt's independence did not end quickly or quietly. It ended in a civil war that Rome imported into Alexandria's own harbor, and the man who brought it there arrived not as a conqueror of Egypt, but as a general chasing a defeated rival across the Mediterranean. Julius Caesar landed at Alexandria in the autumn of 48 BC, pursuing Pompey, his former ally and now his enemy, in Rome's own civil war. Pompey was already dead by the time Caesar arrived, murdered on the orders of Egypt's court in a bid to curry favor with the victor, but Caesar found himself drawn into an entirely separate conflict almost immediately: a succession dispute between the young Ptolemy the 13th and his sister and co-ruler, Cleopatra the 7th, whose famous introduction to Caesar, smuggled into the palace to press her claim in person, is one of the best documented anecdotes of the entire episode. Caesar backed Cleopatra, and the Alexandrian court's supporters of her brother responded by besieging Caesar and his badly outnumbered force inside the palace quarter, touching off several months of urban warfare fought through the streets and harbor of Alexandria itself, a conflict now generally known as the Alexandrian War. At some point during this fighting, a fire broke out in the harbor. The ancient sources that mention it agree on very little beyond the bare fact that it happened. Caesar's own account of his campaigns, dictated to associates and later completed by other hands, describes ordering ships in the harbor burned to prevent them from falling into the hands of his opponents, a targeted, tactical act of arson aimed at denying the enemy naval assets, not, in his own telling, an attack on any building at all. Later writers described the fire spreading beyond the ships themselves. Plutarch, writing his life of Caesar roughly a century and a half after the events, states plainly that the fire, having started among the ships, spread and destroyed the great library. a claim repeated, with variations, by several other writers over the following centuries, and one that eventually hardened into the single most durable popular explanation for the library's loss. The trouble with this account is not that it lacks ancient testimony. The trouble is what the ancient testimony actually consists of, and how far removed most of it stands from the event it describes. Plutarch was writing generations after Caesar's death, drawing on earlier sources now lost to us, and cannot be treated as an eyewitness in any sense. The most striking silence belongs to Strabo, the very geographer whose description of the museum has carried so much of this story's weight, because Strabo visited Alexandria and wrote his account of the city roughly a quarter century after the fire, close enough in time that any catastrophic destruction of the library would have been recent and well within living memory for the Alexandrians he spoke with. Strabo describes the museum, its walkway, its communal hall, its scholars living and dining together in the present tense as a functioning institution. And he says nothing at all about a fire, nothing about a devastated collection, nothing about an institution recovering from catastrophe. A geographer visiting a city a quarter century after its greatest library supposedly burned to the ground and saying nothing whatsoever about it is difficult to reconcile with the idea that the fire had, in fact, destroyed the library in any complete sense. The figure most commonly attached to this story, that 700,000 scrolls were lost in the blaze, does not even come from an account close to the event. It appears centuries later in the work of Ammianus Marcellinus, a Roman soldier and historian writing his history of the empire in the closing decades of the 4th century, more than 400 years after Caesar's campaign. Describing the Serapeum, the temple that by his own time housed Alexandria's most celebrated remaining library, Ammianus pauses to note that within its precincts had once stood collections beyond calculation, and that, as he puts it, the trustworthy testimony of ancient records agreed that 700,000 books, assembled through the tireless care of the Ptolemaic kings, were burned in the Alexandrian War, when the city was sacked under the dictator Caesar. It is a striking passage, and it is the source of the number that has attached itself to this story ever since. But Ammianus is not reporting something he witnessed, or even something a near contemporary witnessed. He is repeating, 4 centuries after the fact, a figure he attributes to unnamed earlier records, in a genre of ancient writing that was, as a matter of routine practice, comfortable with large round numbers deployed for rhetorical effect rather than statistical precision. Modern historians examining this specific claim have generally arrived at the same conclusion reached about the library's overall size in earlier chapters of this story. The number does not deserve to be treated as reliable. Roger Bagnall, whose broader argument about the library's disappearance this film returns to directly later on, has examined the ancient figures for both the library's total holdings and the losses attributed to the Alexandrian War, and concluded that none of them merit real credence as actual counts. The figures multiply and shift across different ancient authors, sometimes describing the main library, sometimes a supposedly separate collection destroyed at the harbor, sometimes conflating the two, in a pattern more consistent with a story being embellished and repeated across centuries than with any original, carefully recorded loss. None of this means the fire is invented. Caesar's own writing confirms that ships were deliberately burned in the harbor during the fighting, and it would be surprising if a fire of that scale, in a densely built dockside district, caused no damage whatsoever to nearby structures. Some ancient sources specifically mention that a store of books, kept near the harbor rather than in the museum's main premises, was among the property destroyed, a detail plausible enough on its own terms, and consistent with the practice, common in a busy Mediterranean port, of keeping certain commercial and administrative stock closer to the waterfront than to the palace quarter further inland. What the evidence does not support is the far larger claim that grew out of this kernel over the following centuries, that Caesar's fire consumed the museum's library as a whole, ending in a single afternoon an institution that Strabo would go on to describe as very much alive a generation later. Egypt itself became a Roman possession within 2 decades of the fire in Alexandria's harbor, following Cleopatra's defeat alongside Mark Antony at Actium and her death in 30 BC, and the change in status was more fundamental than a simple transfer of taxes to a new treasury. Egypt did not become an ordinary Roman province, governed by a senator answerable to the Senate in the usual fashion. Augustus, the first emperor, took the unusual step of placing Egypt under his own direct personal control, administered by a prefect of equestrian rank who reported to the emperor alone, and he barred senators from even entering the province without his express permission. Egypt's grain and Egypt's revenue were simply too valuable to risk placing in the hands of any Roman aristocrat who might use them to build an independent political base. This arrangement meant that Alexandria, and the museum within it, now answered to a single man in Rome rather than to a resident dynasty that had lived among them, been crowned in their temples, and buried its dead beside Alexander in the city's own royal enclosure. The early emperors, to their credit, did not abandon the institution they had inherited. Augustus himself is recorded as having visited Alexander's tomb during his time in the city, an act of calculated respect toward the dynasty he had just extinguished, and the museum continued to function under Roman oversight much as it had under the Ptolemies, its priest now appointed from Rome rather than from a palace a few streets away, as Strabo had already noted without particular alarm. Claudius, who ruled from 41 to 54, went further than simple maintenance. He is credited with adding an entirely new wing to the museum's premises, built specifically to house his own historical writings on Etruscan and Carthaginian history, with provision made for these works to be read aloud publicly to an audience twice each year. It was a vain gesture in one sense, an emperor commissioning space for his own scholarship inside an institution built by a rival dynasty 2.5 centuries earlier. But it was also a genuine act of continued investment, evidence that at least one Roman emperor still regarded association with the museum as worth the expense and the effort of physical expansion. What had changed, however, was not visible in any single decree or any single emperor's generosity or neglect. It was visible only in the accumulated weight of distance. A Ptolemaic king had grown up in Alexandria, had been crowned in an Egyptian temple according to Egyptian rite, as well as a Macedonian one, had walked past the museum's colonnades as a matter of daily routine, and had every personal and dynastic incentive to see the institution flourish as a direct reflection of his own family's prestige. A Roman emperor, by contrast, governed Egypt from thousands of miles away, generally never visited the province at all during an entire reign, and regarded Alexandria as one exceptionally valuable possession among many scattered across 3 continents, its grain shipments mattering considerably more to the ordinary business of imperial administration than the scholarly output of a research institute few Romans outside a small educated elite had any direct experience of. The museum's continued funding, under this new arrangement, no longer flowed from a ruler's personal identification with the institution's success. It flowed instead through the ordinary channels of provincial administration, a line item renewed by prefects and procurators who had their own careers to manage and their own priorities to satisfy, subject to whatever attention or indifference happened to reach Egypt from Rome in any given year. An indifferent emperor costs an institution nothing so long as the indifference continues. But the model offers no defense at all against an emperor who becomes actively unfriendly, because there is no independent source of income standing behind the museum to absorb the shock. Every year of quiet, unremarkable continuation under the early empire was, in this sense, a year of borrowed time rather than a year of genuine security, however comfortable it may have felt to the scholars living through it. For roughly a century and a half after Augustus, that borrowed time held. Scholarship continued at Alexandria under imperial patronage that, if less personally invested than Ptolemaic sponsorship had been, remained real enough in practical terms. The astronomer and geographer known to history simply as Ptolemy, no relation to the vanished royal dynasty, but a scholar working in Roman Alexandria in the 2nd century, during the reigns of Hadrian and the Antonine emperors, produced, most likely with access to the city's accumulated astronomical and geographical resources, the works that would define both disciplines for the following 14 centuries. The Almagest, which codified an Earth-centered model of the cosmos so thoroughly that it displaced Aristarchus's earlier heliocentric hypothesis from serious consideration until the 16th century, and the Geography, which attempted to assign coordinates of latitude and longitude to thousands of locations across the known world. That such foundational work could still be produced in Roman Alexandria 2 centuries after the Ptolemaic dynasty's fall is itself evidence that the museum's scholarly infrastructure and whatever remained of its library holdings had not simply evaporated with Cleopatra's death. The institution Augustus inherited was still, under the Antonines, capable of supporting work that would outlast the Roman Empire itself by more than 1,000 years. That reign arrived in the person of Caracalla, who became sole emperor in the year 211 after arranging the murder of his own brother and co-ruler, Geta, in their mother's presence, and whose relationship with the empire's provinces over the following years was marked by a volatility that stood in sharp contrast to the measured patronage of his Antonine predecessors. By late 215, Caracalla had turned his attention to Alexandria, and what he found there, or believed he found there, provoked one of the most violent episodes any Roman emperor ever visited on a city he was nominally there to rule. The precise origin of Caracalla's grievance is recorded with some inconsistency across the surviving sources, but the general shape agrees. The Alexandrians, never a population known in antiquity for restraint toward their rulers, had mocked the emperor, reportedly for the killing of his brother, and for other conduct the sources describe only vaguely, in a manner that reached his ears and that he judged intolerable. Caracalla's response was not censure or exile for the specific offenders. According to Cassius Dio, a Roman senator and historian who was serving in a position that gave him direct access to court affairs during roughly this period, Caracalla arrived in Alexandria in late 215 under the pretense of a friendly visit, drew the city's young men of military age out under the appearance of forming them into a new military unit in his honor, and then set his own soldiers on them in a planned and deliberate massacre. Dio's account describes the killing as extensive and indiscriminate enough that he declines to give any specific number, stating only that so many died that he could not bring himself to record a figure, while noting separately that Caracalla also unleashed his troops on the wider population and permitted looting across parts of the city. Alongside the massacre itself, Dio records a second and, for the purposes of this story, more directly consequential action. Caracalla abolished the public spectacles that had traditionally been staged for the Alexandrians' entertainment, and he abolished, in the same stroke, the public messes of the city, a phrase that, in the context of everything this film has already established about how the museum actually functioned, points directly at the communal dining arrangements Strabo had described centuries earlier, the shared meals that bound the institution's scholars together as a single supported community. A later chronicler, John Malalas, writing considerably after the event, but drawing on earlier material now lost, states the connection even more explicitly, that Caracalla, in the aftermath of his massacre, cut off the stipends that had funded the museum's scholars. It is worth pausing on how differently this moment reads compared to the destruction narrative examined earlier in this film. Caesar's fire in the harbor left behind an image easy to picture and easier still to dramatize. Flame, smoke, scrolls curling into ash, while a besieged general watched from the palace walls. Caracalla left no comparable image at all. There was no burning building, no single afternoon a chronicler could point to and say, "Here, this is when it ended." There was a massacre, horrifying in its own right, and well enough attested that no responsible account of Alexandria's 3rd century can leave it out. And there was, arriving in its wake with far less ceremony, an administrative order ending a program of payments that had run, with only minor interruption, for roughly 400 years. One event produced bodies in the street. The other produced an empty dining hall and scholars with nowhere left to draw a salary from, and only one of the two has ever been remembered as a catastrophe. The evidence does not allow certainty about how completely or how permanently this cut in funding actually landed. Some later sources, including the biographer Philostratus, writing his account of prominent intellectuals within roughly a decade or two of Caracalla's death, describe the museum's communal meals using language that suggests the arrangement was, by his own time, once again functioning, which has led some historians to conclude that whatever damage Caracalla inflicted on the institution's funding was eventually reversed by a successor eager to repair relations with a province the empire still depended on for grain. This is plausible, and it fits a broader pattern visible throughout the museum's Roman-era history. Individual emperors, hostile or generous by turns, repeatedly proved capable of interrupting or restoring the institution's support according to their own passing judgment, because nothing beyond that judgment stood between the museum and its funding in either direction. But even a full restoration under a later emperor does not undo what the interruption itself demonstrates. An institution that could be cut off from its income by a single vindictive decision made in the aftermath of a massacre and apparently reversed only because a later ruler happened to find the reversal politically convenient, was never in possession of anything resembling institutional security, whatever its scholars might have believed, while the stipends were still arriving on schedule. There is a further complication worth setting out honestly rather than glossing over. It is not established with certainty that the museum's building itself, or its remaining book collection, suffered direct physical damage during Caracalla's massacre and the looting that accompanied it, as opposed to suffering only the administrative interruption of its funding. The ancient sources are more forthcoming about the killing and the abolished stipends than about the fate of any specific structure or any specific shelf of scrolls, and this film has no interest in inventing a burning building where the evidence does not describe one, in the same way it has already declined to accept an inflated and unsupported version of Caesar's fire 2.5 centuries earlier. What can be stated with confidence is narrower and, for the purposes of the argument this film is making, more important than a burning building would be. In the year 215, a Roman emperor, angered by a provincial population rather than by anything the museum's scholars had personally done, punished that population by cutting off, at least for some period afterward, the payments that had sustained the museum's community since the reign of the scholars themselves had done nothing to provoke this. They were simply attached by the institution's own founding logic to a city whose relationship with its ruler could sour for reasons that had nothing to do with scholarship at all. And once that relationship soured, the funding that kept the museum's lamps lit and its dining hall full proved to have no protection whatsoever against becoming collateral damage in a grievance that was never actually about them. The half-century that followed Caracalla's reign brought the Roman Empire closer to outright collapse than it had come at any point since its founding, and Alexandria, still one of the empire's wealthiest and most strategically vital cities, did not escape the consequences of that instability. Emperors rose and fell in rapid, often violent succession through the middle decades of the 3rd century. Provincial armies made and unmade rulers with little reference to Rome itself, and the eastern provinces, Egypt among them, found themselves drawn into a crisis of imperial authority that would eventually produce a challenge to Roman rule unlike anything the region had seen since the Ptolemies themselves. That challenge arose from Palmyra, a wealthy caravan city in the Syrian desert that had grown powerful by controlling trade routes between Rome and Persia, and whose ruler, Odaenathus, had been granted extensive authority over Rome's eastern provinces in recognition of his effectiveness against Persian incursions. When Odaenathus was assassinated around 267, power passed to his widow Zenobia, ruling as regent for their young son, and Zenobia proved far less content than her husband had been to remain a loyal, if powerful, servant of a distant and increasingly unstable Roman throne. Over the following years, she extended Palmyrene control aggressively outward from Syria, and by 270, her forces had pushed into Egypt itself, seizing Alexandria and placing the province, source of so much of the grain that fed the city of Rome, under her own authority rather than the emperor's. Rome's response came under Aurelian, who took the imperial throne in 270 and spent much of his brief but remarkably effective reign methodically reclaiming the territory Zenobia had taken. Egypt was recovered first, in a campaign fought in and around Alexandria itself in the early part of his reign, and the fighting inside the city was, by the accounts that survive, severe. Ammianus Marcellinus, writing his history over a century later, but drawing on earlier records for events that preceded his own lifetime, describes the consequence in a single stark line: that Alexandria's walls were thrown down and the city lost the greater part of the district known as the Brucheium. The Brucheium was not simply one neighborhood among many. It was, by every account of the city's layout that survives from earlier centuries, the royal quarter itself. The district Strabo had described as occupying as much as a third of Alexandria's total area, containing the palaces built up by successive Ptolemaic kings, the tomb of Alexander, and, embedded within that same royal complex, the museum. If Ammianus's brief report is accurate, and there is little reason within the surviving evidence to doubt its basic outline, then the fighting that accompanied Aurelian's recapture of the city in the early 270s did not simply damage some peripheral part of Alexandria. It struck directly at the physical heart of everything the Ptolemies had built 2.5 centuries earlier, the same royal precinct that had housed the communal dining hall, the covered walkway, and the priest's residence that Strabo had once described as still functioning, still populated, still recognizably the institution Demetrius had helped design. What the ancient sources do not provide, and what this film will not manufacture in their absence, is a precise account of what specifically happened to the museum's buildings, or to whatever book collections still remained within them, during this specific episode of urban warfare. No ancient writer describes soldiers setting fire to a library in the Brucheium during Aurelian's campaign, in the way Plutarch had described books burning during Caesar's fire 2.5 centuries earlier. Ammianus's report is a general statement about the district's destruction and the city's walls, offered as part of a broader historical narrative rather than as a targeted account of the museum's specific fate. This absence of detail should not be mistaken for reassurance. It is, if anything, the opposite kind of evidence from what a defender of the institution's continued survival would want. A single dramatic account of a library burning, however unreliable in its particulars, at least tells a historian that the institution was significant enough, and its fate specific enough, to be remembered and recorded as a distinct event. The near-total silence surrounding the museum's condition after the Brucheium's destruction suggests something closer to the pattern this film has traced since Caracalla. Not a single, memorable catastrophe, but an institution quietly ceasing to be discussed at all, because there was decreasingly little left to discuss. Later historians examining the scattered evidence for the museum's activity across the 3rd century have generally concluded that Aurelian's recapture of Alexandria in the early 270s marks the point after which no further securely dated reference to the museum functioning as a living institution survives. Scholars continued to work in Alexandria after this date, and the city itself remained, for centuries afterward, one of the most important intellectual centers anywhere in the Mediterranean world, producing philosophers, mathematicians, and physicians whose reputations would carry well beyond Egypt's borders. But what those later scholars belonged to, in institutional terms, is not clearly the same continuous structure that Demetrius had helped design under Ptolemy the First, that Strabo had described dining together in a shared hall, that Caracalla had punished by cutting off its stipends, something changed in the fighting that destroyed the Brucheium that the surviving evidence is simply too thin to describe in detail, and that thinness is itself among the most telling facts this film has yet encountered. An institution 5 centuries in the building did not require a chronicler to announce its ending in a single dramatic sentence, the way Plutarch had announced Caesar's fire. It required only that the funding stop, the scholars disperse to find support elsewhere, and the buildings that had once housed a state-fed community of the ancient world's finest minds fall, along with the rest of the Brucheium, into the kind of ordinary ruin that draws no particular comment from anyone, because by then, there was no one left whose job it was to notice. By the closing decades of the 4th century, more than 100 years after Aurelian's soldiers left the Brucheium in ruins, the intellectual life that had once centered on the museum had not vanished from Alexandria so much as relocated, in the popular memory of the city and in the accounts of later writers, to a different institution entirely. The Serapeum, the great temple of the god Serapis, built centuries earlier under Ptolemaic patronage and standing, by this point, as the most celebrated religious and cultural monument the city still possessed. Ammianus Marcellinus, describing the temple in the account of his history that covers events roughly contemporary with his own adult life, calls it the most magnificent structure anywhere in the world apart from Rome's own Capitolium, adorned with columned halls and statuary so lifelike it seemed almost to breathe, and he notes, in the same passage, that libraries beyond calculation had once stood within its precincts, gathered together through the tireless attention of the Ptolemaic kings. That phrasing deserves close attention because Ammianus is careful, in the Latin he actually wrote, to place the temple's libraries in the past tense, a detail some later readers have passed over too quickly, but one that matters enormously for what happened next. Ammianus was writing his account of the Serapeum before his own death, which occurred sometime in the final decade of the 4th century, meaning his description was composed close to, and quite possibly before, the events about to unfold there. His grammar suggests, as clearly as ancient prose ever suggests anything, that whatever great library had once filled the Serapeum's halls no longer did so by the time he was writing about it, that the libraries beyond calculation belonged to the temple's past, alongside the 700,000 books he attributes, in the very next sentence, to Caesar's fire 4 centuries earlier, not to its present. The event that would make the Serapeum famous for an entirely different reason began, according to the church historians who documented it in some detail, not as an attack on a library at all, but as a religious provocation. Theophilus, the patriarch of Alexandria's Christian community, discovered around the year 391 what was described as a hidden pagan shrine, and rather than dealing with it quietly, he had its contents put on public display specifically to hold traditional Egyptian and Greek religious practice up to ridicule. Socrates Scholasticus, a church historian writing within a few decades of the events and drawing, by his own account, on testimony from people who had been present, describes Theophilus first clearing out the shrine known as the Mithraeum and exhibiting the tokens of its rites to public mockery, an act calculated to humiliate Alexandria's remaining pagan community rather than simply to suppress it administratively. The humiliation worked exactly as such provocations tend to, which is to say it produced violence rather than submission. Alexandria's pagans, outraged at the public display, attacked the city's Christians, and the Christians, according to Socrates, fought back with enough force that the pagan faction retreated for safety into the one building substantial enough to serve as a fortress, the Serapeum itself, whose massive columned halls and defensible enclosure made it the obvious refuge for a group suddenly finding itself outnumbered in the streets. What followed was less a targeted assault on a library than a siege, conducted against a barricaded religious and political faction that happened to be holed up inside a temple, and it drew the attention of the imperial court in a way that Caracalla's massacre and Aurelian's recapture of the city, both handled locally without apparent reference back to Rome, never had. The Emperor Theodosius I, informed of the violence, issued a rescript ordering that the pagans involved in the initial rioting be pardoned for their role in the unrest, but granting Theophilus permission, according to Socrates, in response to his own vigorous solicitation for exactly this outcome, to proceed with demolishing the temple itself. What followed the emperor's decision was recorded by several church historians in vivid and specific detail, none of it concerned with books. Socrates and the historian Rufinus both describe a soldier climbing to strike the great cult statue of Serapis with an axe, the crowd's fearful hesitation when the blow landed and the sky failed to fall in retribution, and the eventual toppling and burning of the statue's head as it was paraded through the city before the assembled, and by this point, thoroughly cowed pagan population. Theodoret, writing later still, adds the detail, delivered with evident satisfaction, of mice scattering from the hollow interior of the ancient idol as it was broken apart. Rufinus boasts that the statues of Serapis distributed throughout the city were cut down and filed away so thoroughly that no trace of the god survived anywhere in Alexandria. The temple building itself, according to the Egyptian chronicler John of Nikiu, writing considerably later, was eventually replaced by a Christian martyrium and church built on or beside the same enclosure. What none of these accounts describe, at any point, in any of the several independent versions that survive from writers with genuinely differing perspectives and, in Rufinus's case, an obvious eagerness to celebrate every detail of the pagan temple's humiliation, is the burning of a library. Socrates does not mention books. Rufinus does not mention books. Theodoret does not mention books. Sozomen, another church historian working from independent sources around the same period, does not mention books. Eunapius of Sardis, a contemporary pagan writer who loathed Christianity and would have had every motive imaginable to record the destruction of a great pagan library as one further Christian atrocity to set beside the toppling of the god statue, does not mention books either, and Eunapius was, by profession and temperament, exactly the kind of book-loving scholar who would not have passed over such a loss in silence had it actually occurred during an episode he clearly regarded as a catastrophe worth documenting in detail. What every one of these writers describes, independently and consistently, is a religious and political riot that ended in the destruction of a temple, its statues, and its cult apparatus, a story that has every reason to have mentioned a burning library, if one had happened, and that never does. 2.5 centuries after Theophilus's mob toppled Serapis in the temple courtyard, Alexandria changed hands one final time, and this last conquest would eventually produce the most durable and most repeated destruction story of them all. Durable enough that, to this day, it remains the version most people encounter first, and sometimes the only version they ever encounter. The Arab conquest of Egypt unfolded across the early 1640s, led by the general Amr ibn al-Az, under the authority of the Caliph Umar, and Alexandria itself, after a period of siege and negotiation, fell into Arab hands by the middle of the decade. The conquest is documented from multiple independent angles by writers reasonably close to the events themselves. John of Nikiu, an Egyptian bishop writing his chronicle within a few decades of the conquest, describes the fighting and the eventual surrender of the city in considerable detail. Sophronius, the Patriarch of Jerusalem and a contemporary figure with every reason to lament the loss of Christian territory to Arab armies, wrote extensively about the broader conquest of the region during these same years. Neither of these near-contemporary witnesses, nor any other writer working within a century or more of the actual conquest, records anything resembling the burning of a great library in Alexandria at the hands of the conquering Arab forces. That silence matters enormously, because the story that eventually did attach itself to the conquest is remarkably specific, remarkably vivid, and remarkably late. It holds that Amr ibn al-As, upon taking the city, was petitioned by a Christian philosopher named John the Grammarian to spare the remaining books of Alexandria's library, that Amr was personally inclined to grant this request, and that he wrote to the caliph Umar in Arabia for permission to do so. Umar's reply, as the story preserves it, has become one of the most quoted lines in the entire mythology surrounding the library's end, that if the writings in question agreed with the content of the Quran, they were unnecessary, since the Quran already contained what was needed, and that if they disagreed with it, they were dangerous and ought to be destroyed regardless. Following this instruction, the story continues, Amr ordered the books distributed among the city's public bathhouses, where they were burned as fuel for the furnaces, keeping the baths heated for a period some versions give as 6 months. The story is dramatic, morally legible in exactly the way this film has already identified as the hallmark of the versions that get remembered, and almost entirely without foundation in the surviving evidence. The earliest source to mention it at all is a Baghdadi physician named Abd al-Latif, who traveled through Egypt in the year 1203, describing in passing a library he says Amr burned with Umar's permission, offering no detail and no source of his own for the claim. A somewhat fuller version appears roughly 2 decades later in the work of the Egyptian scholar Ibn al-Kifti, writing around 1227 in a biographical history of learned men, where the story appears attached to his account of John the Grammarian's life, and where Ibn al-Kifti himself, remarkably, undercuts his own narrative by admitting that he had once been told the specific number of bathhouses involved and had simply forgotten it, closing his account with the line, "Listen to this story and marvel," phrasing that reads less like sober historical reporting and more like a storyteller inviting his audience to be entertained. The version that eventually became standard in Western scholarship came from Bar Hebraeus, a Syriac Christian scholar and bishop who lived from 1226 to 1289, writing roughly 6.5 centuries after the conquest he was describing, and who appears to have drawn his account directly from Ibn al-Kifti's earlier version rather than from any independent tradition of his own. Scholars who have examined this chain of transmission closely have found it collapsing at nearly every point of contact with the historical record it claims to describe. John the Grammarian, the philosopher whose plea for the books supposedly moved Amr to write to the caliph in the first place, is generally reckoned by historians of the period to have lived and died roughly 3.5 centuries before the Arab conquest took place, making his personal appearance before Amr chronologically impossible on the story's own terms. The physical mechanics of the tale fare no better under scrutiny. A substantial proportion of the books that would still have existed in 7th century Alexandria were written on parchment or vellum rather than papyrus, a material that does not burn readily enough to serve as effective furnace fuel. And modern estimates of the sheer quantity of material that would have been required to keep bathhouse furnaces running continuously across many months run into the millions of individual volumes, a figure wildly out of proportion to anything the ancient or medieval evidence suggests actually remained in Alexandria by the 1640s. Perhaps most tellingly, a historian working centuries later, Ibn Khaldun, records an almost identical story concerning the deliberate destruction of a library of Persian texts, also supposedly ordered by the Caliph Umar, using strikingly similar language and structure, a repetition that points strongly toward a recurring literary motif about pious conquest overriding pagan learning, attached opportunistically to different libraries in different regions, rather than toward 2 separate and independently verified historical events. European scholars raised doubts about the story long before modern historical method existed to formalize those doubts systematically. Eusèbe Renaudot, a French Orientalist publishing his history of Alexandria's patriarchs in 1713, described the tale as having, in his own words, something untrustworthy about it, based on nothing more than a careful reader's sense that the account did not sit comfortably alongside more reliable evidence. Edward Gibbon, writing his history of Rome's decline later in the same century, related the story with evident narrative relish, as a historian of his era might be forgiven for doing with such a colorful anecdote, before turning immediately to reject it in his own analysis, stating plainly that he was strongly tempted to deny both the fact itself and the consequences that later writers had drawn from it. Gibbon's skepticism, remarkably, rested on some of the same textual evidence this film has already examined. He noted that Ammianus Marcellinus's own description of the Serapeum, written in the past tense before the temple's destruction in 391, already implied that no substantial library remained there to be destroyed by anyone: Christian rioters in the 4th century or Arab conquerors in the 7th, since by Ammianus's own account there was nothing left in the building for either group to burn. If none of the 4 dramatic stories this film has now examined actually accounts for the library's disappearance, the honest question left standing is the one that has been implicit since the very first chapter. What, then, actually happened? The answer that best fits the surviving evidence was set out most rigorously by the American historian Roger Bagnall in a 2002 essay that this film has already drawn on repeatedly for its treatment of the ancient figures attached to the library's size and losses, and it is worth presenting Bagnall's argument now in its own right, because it is less a single explanation than a reorientation of the entire question. Bagnall's central point is that the search for a destroyer has always been, in a certain sense, the wrong search. Historians and popular writers alike, confronted with a great institution's disappearance, have instinctively reached for a villain and a moment, because a villain and a moment produce a satisfying narrative, complete with blame and closure. But Bagnall argues that this impulse says more about what readers want from history than about what actually happened to a 5-century-old collection of papyrus scrolls housed in a Mediterranean port city. Papyrus itself, he points out, is not a durable material under ordinary conditions. It is vulnerable to humidity, to insects, to simple handling over time, and a scroll copied in the reign of Ptolemy the First had no realistic prospect of surviving 5, 6, or 7 centuries of Alexandria's coastal climate without active, continuous intervention, meaning regular recopying, careful storage, and a staff of scribes and custodians whose entire function was to keep the collection from quietly rotting away on its shelves. This is not incidental background information. It is the crux of Bagnall's whole argument. A library of scrolls is not a static object that persists until something destroys it. It is an ongoing labor, renewed constantly, and it survives for exactly as long as someone keeps doing that labor and no longer. This reframing changes what the earlier chapters of this film's investigation actually mean, taken together. Caracalla's cut-in stipends did not need to destroy a single scroll directly to inflict lasting damage on the collection. It only needed to interrupt, for however many years the interruption lasted, the ordinary maintenance that kept older texts from crumbling and newer copies from being made to replace them. Aurelian's destruction of the Brucheium did not need to burn every book in the museum's holdings to end the institution in any meaningful sense. It only needed to scatter the community of scribes and scholars whose daily presence was the entire mechanism by which the collection had ever been sustained in the first place. Once that community dispersed, whatever scrolls survived the physical destruction of the district had no one left to recopy them before age and climate finished the job that no soldier's torch had actually needed to start. Bagnall's phrase for this, stated with the flat clarity of a historian determined not to soften an uncomfortable conclusion, is that it is the absence of institutions, not the presence of some destructive force, that decided the fate of the books of Alexandria. A further material factor compounded this slow attrition during precisely the centuries this film has already traced through Aurelian's campaign and Theophilus's riot: the gradual replacement, across the Roman world generally during the 3rd and 4th centuries, of the traditional papyrus scroll by the codex, the bound page format that is the direct ancestor of the modern book. The codex offered real practical advantages over the scroll. Texts became easier to navigate, more compact to store, and more durable in binding than an unrolled sheet of papyrus exposed at both ends. But the transition carried a specific and largely unacknowledged cost for any collection built up over previous centuries in the older format. A scroll not actively transferred into the new codex format during this transitional period was, in a very real sense, being left behind by the technology and the labor of the age. Increasingly unlikely to be recopied by scribes whose training and materials were now oriented toward the newer format, and increasingly treated by the simple economics of scarce scribal labor as a lower priority than producing fresh codices of the texts still considered actively useful. A great scroll collection assembled under the Ptolemies and only partially maintained through the disruptions of the 3rd century now faced a second, quieter threat in the 4th. Not destruction, but obsolescence, the specific fate of material that nobody bothers to actively kill because it is simply, gradually, no longer being renewed. Ammianus Marcellinus, whose careful past tense description of the Serapeum's vanished libraries has already done so much work in this film's account of the events of 391, provides one further piece of testimony that speaks directly to this broader pattern, and it deserves to stand at the emotional center of this chapter rather than being treated as a passing aside. In a separate passage of his history, describing the general cultural condition of Rome itself during roughly this same late 4th century period, Ammianus writes with open contempt about what he takes to be a decline in serious intellectual life among the Roman aristocracy of his own day. The households that had once, he says, been celebrated for their devoted pursuit of serious study, now overflow, instead, with the idle amusements of a sluggish indolence. Singers are summoned in place of philosophers, teachers of theatrical spectacle in place of orators, and, in the line that has survived as perhaps the single most quietly devastating sentence in this entire 5th-century story, Ammianus records that the libraries of his own time stand shut up forever in the manner of tombs, while enormous water organs and lyres built to the scale of carriages are manufactured instead. It would be difficult to find, anywhere in the surviving literature of the ancient world, a more precise ancient articulation of the exact argument this film has been building toward across every chapter since Caracalla's stipends were first cut in the year 215. Ammianus is not describing Alexandria specifically in this passage. He is describing a broader Roman cultural mood, a general late imperial preference for spectacle and entertainment over the sustained, unglamorous, and expensive labor of maintaining institutions of serious learning. But the image he chooses, entirely unprompted by any connection to the Alexandrian story this film has traced, could not fit that story more exactly if it had been written for the purpose. Libraries shut up like tombs are not libraries that have burned. A tomb is not a ruin created by violence. It is a structure that stands, intact and undisturbed, sealed against the living, visited by no one, its contents preserved in the dark precisely because no one any longer has reason to open the door. That is not a description of catastrophe. It is a description of neglect so complete it has become a kind of permanent, silent monument to itself, which is, this film would argue, exactly what happened to the great collection the Ptolemies built, somewhere across the accumulated weight of Caracalla's anger, Aurelian's siege, Theophilus's riot, and 100 smaller, entirely unrecorded decisions by scribes, administrators, and emperors across 5 centuries, each one individually too small to deserve a chronicler's attention, and each one collectively sufficient to leave nothing behind for a later traveler to find. None of this should be mistaken for a claim that everything the museum's scholars ever produced was lost entirely. A meaningful portion of the great scientific and literary achievement this film surveyed in its earlier chapters did survive, though rarely by the direct, unbroken transmission a modern reader might assume. Euclid's Elements survived because it was recopied, repeatedly, across the very transition from scroll to codex that stranded so much else, precisely because later generations of scribes, Byzantine and eventually Arabic, continued to judge it worth the labor of preservation. Ptolemy's astronomical and geographical works survived largely through Arabic translation and transmission during the medieval Islamic world's own flowering of scholarship, centuries after Alexandria's own institutional decline, reaching medieval Europe eventually by that circuitous route, rather than any direct line back to the museum's shelves. Portions of Aristarchus's heliocentric argument survive only because a later writer, Archimedes, happened to mention and describe the hypothesis in a work of his own that did survive, meaning the idea outlived its original text entirely, preserved as a second-hand reference embedded inside someone else's argument. This pattern, repeated across dozens of authors and texts, is itself the clearest possible evidence for Bagnall's underlying thesis. What survived did so because someone, somewhere, in some century, judged it worth the continued labor of recopying, and what did not survive did not do so not because a single enemy destroyed it in a single afternoon, but because that continued labor, across the specific centuries this film has now traced in detail, quietly stopped. Return now to the harbor at Alexandria in the year 1349 to the Moroccan traveler standing before a lighthouse he had climbed as a younger man and could no longer even enter. Everything this film has traced in the intervening centuries, Caracalla's silenced stipends, the Bruchium reduced to rubble under Aurelian, a temple's idol broken apart while its libraries had already gone unmentioned for who knows how long, a story about bathhouse furnaces built from nothing many centuries after the conquest it claimed to describe. And finally, Ammianus's own bleak image of libraries sealed shut like tombs, while lyres the size of carriages were built instead. All of it had already happened by the time Ibn Battuta made his second visit. He was arriving, without knowing it, at the far end of a story that had finished so quietly no one had thought to mark its ending. The lighthouse gave him something to record, precisely because it had failed in the one way institutions are allowed to fail memorably: an earthquake, a specific and datable catastrophe, striking a structure that had stood in more or less recognizable form for over a millennium and a half. Ibn Battuta could measure its base, note the collapse of its upper stories, and set his second visit against his memory of his first, because the Pharos had left him a ruin, stone he could stand beside, a doorway he could describe as impassable, a clear and specific difference between what he had climbed in 1326 and what he found waiting for him 23 years later. This is what physical catastrophe gives the historical record that slow institutional starvation never does: a fixed point, a before and an after, something a careful traveler can point to and say, here, this is what changed, and here is when. The library offered him nothing of the kind, not because its loss was somehow less complete than the lighthouses, but because its loss had no fixed point to offer anyone at all. There was no earthquake attached to its disappearance, no single afternoon a chronicler could set against an earlier visit the way Ibn Battuta set 1349 against 1326. There was only the accumulated weight of everything this film has spent its previous chapters excavating: a massacre's stipends never fully restored, a royal quarter's walls thrown down in a recapture that left no separate account of what happened to the scrolls inside them, a codex transition that quietly stopped renewing what a scroll format could no longer justify recopying, and centuries of scribes and administrators making small, unrecorded, individually reasonable decisions that collectively amounted to a library nobody was tending anymore. By the time any single generation might have thought to ask where the great collection had gone, there was no one left who had watched it go, no rubble to inspect, no ruin to visit in search of an answer. Only its total, undramatic absence from a city that had, by then, simply stopped expecting it to be there. There is a final detail from the Pharos' own later history that makes this contrast even sharper, and it belongs here, at the very end of this account, rather than earlier. In 1477, More than a century after Ibn Battuta found the lighthouse impossible to enter, the Mamluk Sultan Qaitbay ordered a fortress built on the very foundation where the pharaohs had stood, using, in large part, the lighthouse's own fallen stones as building material. The fort still stands today on Alexandria's eastern harbor, occupying the identical ground the ancient wonder once occupied, constructed quite literally from its predecessor's remains. Continuity preserved even through total loss. A physical through line running from the reign of Ptolemy II, who is credited with the lighthouse's completion all the way to a Mamluk sultan working 17 centuries later, and on to the modern visitor who can stand on that same spot today and know with certainty exactly what came before. No comparable through line exists for the museum and its library. Nothing was built from its stones, because by the time anyone might have thought to reuse them, there was no clear site left to associate with the institution at all. No foundation a later sultan could build upon. No ruin a modern archaeologist could excavate with confidence and say, this, specifically, is where Demetrius advised Ptolemy. This is where Eratosthenes measured the Earth's shadow. This is where Herophilus traced the nerves running from the human eye to the human brain. Underwater archaeology, conducted off Alexandria's coast in recent decades, has recovered fragments of the ancient royal quarter, submerged by earthquakes and the slow subsidence of the coastline over many centuries, and these efforts continue to reshape what can be known about the physical Alexandria the Ptolemies built. But no expedition has recovered the library itself, because the library was never a building in the way the lighthouse was a building. It was a 5-century act of continuous, expensive, unglamorous maintenance performed by scribes and funded by rulers who kept deciding, year after year, that the expense was worth paying until enough of them, across enough generations, quietly decided it was not. That is the actual shape of the story this film set out to tell, and it is a harder story to sit with than the one involving a conqueror and a torch, precisely because it offers no villain to blame and no single moment to mourn. Caesar's fire, examined honestly, turns out to have been real, partial, and centuries later, inflated into something it never was. Theophilus's mob, examined honestly, turns out to have destroyed a temple that no longer held the books later legend gave it. Amr ibn al-Az, examined honestly, appears to have burned nothing at all. The entire bathhouse story, a tale assembled 6 centuries after his death, from sources that cannot even agree on how many baths were involved. What actually happened to Alexandria's library was slower, quieter, and in its own way, more damning than any of these dramatic accounts, because it places the responsibility not on a single invading force, but on an empire and a series of rulers within it who simply stopped choosing, decade after decade, to keep paying for what earlier generations had built. Ibn Battuta walked through a city that had long since stopped noticing the absence, measuring a broken lighthouse because a broken lighthouse was the only ruin left standing that a careful traveler could actually see. If this account of what really happened to Alexandria's library, and what it says about how easily even the greatest institutions can be lost not to fire but to neglect, is one you think deserves wider telling, subscribe and share it. Because the clearest lesson this 5-century story leaves behind is not about ancient Egypt at all. It is about how quietly the things a civilization values most can disappear, long before anyone thinks to ask who is still paying to keep them.